I learned a little bit from being here myself last time. What, I'm not sure, but I learned a lot actually, because you know what happened to me was that I'm in the middle of writing a book, and I brought with me the first chapter, which I had written really last semester, I would say. And it's a rewrite. So, I came to you with this is, I wasn't sure how to present it. And it was a long chapter, and so I did want to, and so I wasn't sure I really landed. I didn't read Randy's interpretation, but so I'm going to give you a brief summary of what I want you to know from last time. Don't tell me if you don't or not, because we have other things to go on to, all right? But later you can. I hope you'll follow better. Not that I don't have a pedagogical idea in mind that Randy and I talked about. Start as abstract as you can and go to the concrete has been how I started teaching 100 years ago. And although students always cry for the first 3 weeks in my class, they seem to like it once they find the space. So we don't have 3 weeks, so we may never make it here, but I'll try. So, today we're going to talk about Marxism in some way, and what cultural studies did to Marxism. We're going to touch briefly on Stuart Hall, very briefly, and then run to, I think, mostly Frederick Jameson, who is famous, for writing a piece which you did not read, called The Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, in which he really describes postmodernism, which I'm sure you know is a word we have to talk about when we talk about cultural studies, and described it in such a way that has almost everyone thinks that what he said is what postmodernism is. You can tell already I don't know if I think that, but he's responsible for a brilliant, if you have never read that essay, it is a brilliant essay. The first thing I ever heard Fred say was, Walter Benjamin, he is ours. Honest to God, that was the first. Ours, you know what that means, I hope. Jameson has a desire to make things into a certain kind of Marxism, and I've never seen such a drive as his, and I learned a lot from what it means to sort of appropriate. So many people have used Jameson's descriptions of postmodernism without knowing much of Marxism, so they didn't know exactly what he was doing there. I'm sure there are Marxists here, and I'm a version of one too, so we may never touch on the same version, but I've always thought that Marxism has had to recover since Jameson. What he did to post-structuralism wasn't great either, and probably made postmodernism a bad word forever. Nonetheless, a brilliant piece, really, so I'm not joking. I picked another piece because I want to talk more about television, but I will go through today with you from Political Unconscious, his most wonderful book on Althusser, and show you what his drive is, how it leads to postmodernism as we know it, and then say, let's erase that and see where we can go. But his descriptions of postmodernism, because they're like television itself. We all know them whether we read it or not. Flattening out history, removing depth, making everything superficial. Notice it all sounds bad. Speeding up the relationship between space and time. The end of just about everything, and especially the end of the grand narrative, which is, as far as modernism goes, and we are talking about that, the Oedipal narrative. Okay, so my mention of Freud last time isn't sort of accidental. You'll see with Jameson, Althusser, Louis Althusser, who really is a big piece. When I first met Stuart Hall, the same time I met Fred, Althusser was a big piece of cultural studies, and a big piece of post-structuralism, right? And Althusser, at least in his treatment of ideology, links up with Lacan, which of course I didn't mention last time, nor will I do it too much, but it is a working out in cultural study, the old Marxist-Freudian connection, the old Marxist-Freudian link, which has been with Marxism on and off, and with all politics on and off for a long time, you know. I mean, feminism goes on and off too. Next time we're going to do things that you may connect with cultural studies more, feminism, identity politics. So we will, I hope, get there. Okay, because we're going to be talking about history today, and the nature of history and grand narrative, and the subject of history, and the author, and identity, and all those unities, and how Jameson cries over their breakdown, and what that means. I wanted to start somewhere else before we went there, and that's what last time was about. Let me summarize. I'm going to take all of 10 minutes probably to summarize. See, I practiced this time. I came here from pneumonia and a broken tooth last time, so I didn't. It's the truth. I didn't practice. So okay. Look, Derrida's piece that I gave you, which probably you still have not read, but I hope you will someday. It's really a brilliant piece, but it's not easy. But I do have students now who actually go back and read it and say they can finally understand it. You know, some things you have to go back. Let us not forget others were hard to read too. Derrida's piece was written, by the way, in 1967, that piece. It is about a piece that Freud wrote in 1925. Okay? In that piece, Derrida suggests, my favorite ideas of Freud, he says, in fact, the very ideas that will become mine at my best, I take from Freud when he was at his best. Now, all that could mean is that Derrida thinks that when he can appropriate Freud's ideas is when Freud's at his best. But that's interesting, okay? I think Freud is at his best when he's using this metaphor of the little writing machine. Now, I didn't say all of this last time, but in 1995, Derrida writes another book called Archive Fever. I don't know if you've seen it. And in it he says, wow, I really liked that piece that I wrote about Freud. I'm translating. But it's true, he does. I really liked it. There was a lot in it, and he's so right. And I was very smart, and what I was really talking about there was telecommunications. Now, I've told you that Derrida has been talking about telecommunications always. But in Archive Fever, he says, what I must have been really thinking about there was tele-technology, email, computers, and everything. So I want to say to you, remember I'm summing, so don't ask me any questions because we'll never move. I'm summing up. I want to say to you that Derrida, or what I was really saying, or what I'm saying in my book, is Derrida completes Freud's project in the metaphor of telecommunications. He is giving us, I mean everywhere, not just in that one piece. His entire work is about writing the unconscious for television. Now, when I say in the metaphor of tele-technology, let me remind you that that piece, which you haven't read, so you know this is great from memory, that piece actually goes and says, Derrida says, Freud writes the unconscious best when he writes it in the metaphor of this little writing pad. Now, I probably didn't make it clear, but the little machine is interesting to Freud and to Derrida because it's a writing machine, because for Freud, the unconscious is memory. That's what the unconscious is. It's memory. Or at least that's what Derrida's most interested in when he talks about the psyche as memory. I mention that because we're about to do history. So what we say of memory, it's not far about what we're going to say about history, okay? So Freud says, I like this pad. And Derrida says, you know, what he likes about this little pad, he's always liked. I can start all the way back at the beginning with Freud, which he does in that piece, and show you all the metaphors he's used and all the ways he's tried to explain the psyche, and it's always the same thing. This is what he wants. He wants for the psyche to be nothing but a generative machine or a generative mechanism that allows for the reproduction of repetitions. Think of the pad. When you write on it, it collects everything. You know what I'm talking about, that little thing, right? When you write on it, it collects everything. And Freud says, but every time you make a mark, the entire thing changes. Got that? And at the same time, the surface is cleared at all times. So it's infinitely opened and infinitely receptive, but it's only able to be receptive because it entirely changes every time underneath. Derrida really wants to talk about a mechanism that, in order to work, changes its connections and reproduces the possibility for repetition. It is not a machine that holds anything, and that's a big change for Freud. I mean, it's a big change in the history of it. It's not holding memories, it's not holding symbols, it's not holding rules. There's nothing there. And in fact, if something's there, it's not even the same thing each time it's there. So I mentioned that point. Now, if we say that Derrida is doing the unconscious in terms of tele-technology, I actually say that even Freud's doing the unconscious in terms of tele-technology, because I'm arguing, a la Derrida, that technologies pull thought from the future. I don't know why, because I think that's such a cool idea. And let us not forget that when Freud's writing in 1925, Derrida says, why is he playing around with this little toy? We've got cinema. We've got really interesting cinema. 1915, Birth of a Nation, which is not interesting cinema in certain ways, but technically it's modern cinema. I mean, it's really surprising. We have Sergei Eisenstein. I mean, everything you're going to see that's great about cinema is already there. And Freud was interested in cameras and movies, but why this little pad? So this is my next two steps. Derrida says, these are not my steps, his steps at the end of the essay. Derrida says, I'm suspicious that Freud's using that little toy. I think we should look at the technology that was really in the world. And I want to say that the technology in the world gives machines that give metaphors for memory. Okay? And that's how we understand memory, by those metaphors given by the machine. Someone asked me, because I remembered all the questions I didn't answer well. You know, I go home and then go, oh. What was that? Someone asks me sometimes, why did I say machines give time? I also had another problem. Let me tell you what it was. I'm working on two ideas of machines in the book. One is Derrida's and one is Deleuze and Guattari's. And there is a place in the book where they cross, but they got crossed here too fast. So I remember that was not working well. I'm so sorry. Maybe we'll get to that some other time. I'm going to be good today and not like anything cross. Except my eyes. So Derrida, of course, is saying that those metaphors, because they're about memory, are about repetition, and therefore they negotiate grids of temporal spatial relationships, okay? So if you think of that they're memory machines, you can see that the machine gives certain ideas. Now, look where we're going to go, you know. Postmodernism is described in terms of transformations and changes in temporal spatial relationships in a big way. That's also connected with end of history and all that stuff. And the icon of postmodernism in everybody's writing is television. And everyone thinks that that's what television is doing somehow, or helps us talk even about it, or even say that's what's happening, even if it isn't. So television certainly gives us some language. So Derrida goes another step, and I hope I can do this one for you because it takes a little oomph. If the machine each time, with the development of technology, gives new machines, let's say, I'm being a little crude maybe, I don't know, and changes the relationships of time-space and therefore changes memory, then we could say, and he does say, and that what is history then if each time technology changes the nature of history? Each time technology gives different historicities, different forms of history. So all those people, you know, the other subtext I had for you last time that I can, now that we've shifted out who's going to be here and who isn't, I can say, you know, the endless remarks that Derrida talked about, there's nothing there, there's no reality, there's no nothing, there's no history, is just very, very, very bad reading. Because to say that there's new forms of historicity is not the same to say there's no history, or that it's the end of history. It may be the end of history as we know it, and that might depress you, and you may not like it, and we may not want to do it, but I think we don't have a choice, frankly, but okay. But it's not the same as saying that's all he said, because he didn't. Now, if each time we say a machine, the history of the machine gives historicity, What is that history of the machine? Well, we can't tell that history of the machine, actually, even though I just said that. So when I got to the end, I wanted to tell you that Derrida uses this term aporia of time, where you can't start history because of what I just said. There is no origin, there is not one history. There's always this crossing that sort of you stop someplace and you can't go back any further. You wait, the machine gives the basis of history in a sense, and yet you want to talk about the history of the machine. So there's no answer there. So that time ends nowhere. In some sense, this is what Derrida means by the origin is non-originary, or there's only originary repetition. I remember those words came up and some people asked me about them. It's an ontological move he's making, that there is at the beginning no beginning, that the beginning has to be crossed through. So the other argument, which we don't have to do today, that I tried to make, is that ontologically speaking, being with a capital B is pulled down by Derrida into the machine, or into what I would call finitude. Now that's a more complicated thing, but I think I've said enough that we could lay it there and maybe get back to it. The final thing, by saying what I just said, the other argument I wanted to make, and again I'll just sketch it because we might find it again at the end of today, is that Derrida finally says, this is not just about metaphors. In fact, there is no unconscious memory without a technical substrate, that they're inseparable. Now he's shy, but I'm ready to be less shy because I'm probably dumber than he is. I mean, because that's how you get unshy about thought, you're dumb. Because I think he often knows why you shouldn't do these things. But I'm ready to say that tele-technology reveals that, ontologically speaking, human beings are certainly not prior to machines. That that unconscious memory, at least, is linked to its technical substrate and cannot be separated from it. I know how to certainly be sure of this from modern times on, and maybe before that we would say something else, but I'm less interested because I'm doing ontology, which I think is something we do in modernity, actually. And I think Derrida's saying that you can't separate the machine from memory. Now I'm mentioning that because you're going to see that Frederick Jameson insists on separating human beings from machines. And the last one to really work on this was Heidegger. And certainly Derrida is a Heideggerian, is moving out of Heidegger, right? Okay, I don't mind taking one little question, but I'm afraid if we don't move on.
With a little question, and I wasn't...
Because I know it's not going to be little.
I just didn't know when you're talking about a machine at this point, if you're meaning either.
But last time, and I won't do it now, but last time we did talk a little bit about connectionism in psychology and neurophysiology and Freud's early ideas of neurophysiology. Derrida's whole point here, because I really like this question, is that the machine that Freud insists is outside and therefore he's only using as a metaphor is internal to the psyche. So that this notion, are you inside or outside, as you just asked the question, is exactly what I'm trying to break down. Right. And Derrida goes so far as to say that death is in the psyche. That the death instinct, which Freud never once said, is that death is the condition of possibility of life. And I'm not saying this in some sort of dialectical Christian-y kind of way, that death gives life, but that if there's no life at the beginning, and if there's no origin at the beginning, then at the beginning is life and not life, which is therefore also life, in that sense, death. So it goes all the way there, your question. So we'll go back to that, okay? Because it might be more fun to move on and then later go back, because that lays it out again. Because we could go, when you start doing death and life, we can go someplace. Mostly because the notion of limitations is somewhere there. Why do you say page 30? Okay. Let me see what I'm doing here. Okay. I got it. Television. So I don't think television is a small matter in tele-technology. I think all cultural studies was about tele-technology so far, and that a lot of stuff is. It's suffering the change, as I'm suggesting. So I wanted to tell you that today I'm going to use television as a way to do the link between Marxism and cultural studies. I mean television, but Jameson means video. So is that why you asked that? Or okay, good. Jameson, has in that piece. So now some of us have read this time, right? Okay, good. In that piece, I don't care. In that, I don't. That's for your pleasures, but I'm assuming maybe you hadn't. Jameson has to do video because he tells you, I can't look at television, it makes me shake, So, and in a way, it is true that what he does with video allows him to say much more interesting things, which is one of my points, than Birmingham School or Stuart Hall, who's really desperate to explain what's on television. And I'm much less interested than what's on television than the technology in relationship. And you'll see Jameson make some of the arguments that I was making, and I was comforted when I found them there, about technology and history and the machines and mediations of culture, and it's all temporal and the aesthetic. And so it's his version of what I was just saying, and I learned from him that. So video, of course, gives that more interestingly. One of the reasons is that video doesn't have narrative, and narrative is exactly what we're looking about, what happens to narrative. Because narrative is what, let me explain what narrative is, since you asked the question, so we're off track already, but all right. A narrative is a way of treating temporal spatial relationships in, I would say, a compensatory way. It's fictive time, as Jameson uses the notion. It's a fiction that produces linearity, movement from beginning, middle, and end, so it can hide, and in fact I think does, even though he loves narrative, hide the temporal spatial relationships the machine gives. So you can, that's why I say it's compensatory. I mean, it covers over, it hides, it adds, and so it allowed him to both look at the machine, the video, without the narrative, and then he could go on and lament, oh God, what will we do without narrative? And at the same time mention, interestingly enough, and there's a great quote in that piece, the best, when he says, it's interesting that television can do narrative. It's the 1 minute when he talks about television. Now, Jameson wrote this piece in 19 what does it say? Because television has changed amazingly since he wrote the piece. And everything he saw in video is all over regular old junky television, right? You know that, right? Not only that, we're talking now even zapping, time shifting, all that stuff that he really wasn't looking at. But I'm even talking about, the kind of things coming out of the things, or Millennium where the heads open up and it's all these things happening. There were non-narrative elements really featured, almost being thematized in regular prime time. But it wasn't there for him. So it was a smart move. Now, I could tell you that many people have written about the way Jameson talks about video. I like it myself, but, some people think no. And, if you go see Bill Viola's show right now, you won't see Jameson there either, I don't think, but which is a very pretty show. I liked it. I guess some people don't, I've heard. Okay, but I like Bill Viola. When you stay with someone a long time, and you get to know them, you're happy to see them.
This is one of the ones that's new to this fossil time around 1990.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. What am I going to say? Yes. Oh, television. Yeah. Okay. I wanted to give you Encoding Decoding because it's famous. It's, a canonical piece in cultural studies. And when I give it to students, I like to say, it's 1973 that it's written. I don't think it's published in 1973. I think it's first published a little later. There are other things that are written in 1973 for those of you who know things. Laura Mulvey's piece on visual pleasure in cinema. It's a hot year, 1973. 1973 is the year David Harvey, David Harvey, right, of Postmodern Condition, Marxist, writing in some similar vein to Jameson, right? I love David Harvey because he actually can say, postmodernity starts in 1973, Okay, but of course he argues that the Keynesian economics, Fordism, that the crisis of Keynesian economics and the crisis of Fordism is really visible in 1973, and he thinks that that's the beginning of globalization, blah, 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 a lot of things we talk about that we would now put in postmodernity. I think that's very interesting. I'm grateful he actually says the number 1973, because here it's so interesting to see how slow we are, right? Here is Stuart Hall, wasting paper to say, I hope you found the piece interesting, but really, in 1898, John Dewey writes Reflex Arc, in which, he says everything's interpreted before one responds, So, to write this whole piece on, guess what? People, you don't just send messages out and people get them just like this. They actually, it involves an interpretation process, is really incredible. That we're talking about postmodernity and all the things finally someone like Frederick Jameson will say just a few years later, in 1973 it's nowhere. Someone's still struggling with trying to show that when messages go out, there are at least 3 little possibilities about how we're going to read them. Notice he uses television as his metaphor, but says nothing about television. It's just sitting there. And of course now you've gotten the idea that I'm interested in when people are using metaphors and how they use them. Because that's what the book's about in some ways. But it's very interesting to me that he doesn't care about television. In fact, already 2 years before that, what's his name, who writes about flow? Williams. Probably. I was thinking of Williams. Raymond Williams, writing about flow in television, that television is flow. This isn't even as good as that, and that was already an interesting idea. One of the things that doesn't happen in that piece, and I won't repeat the piece, I just want to say that about it, is, he has this notion that there are 3 responses. One is the preferred message, which is an interesting word. One is a local revision, negotiated reading. And the final, of course, which is always interesting to us, is you leap out of the whole code and sort of, come with an oppositional code, which sort of led him to thinking lots of things. He talks about circuitry, but he never takes the notion of circuitry seriously. And in some sense, although he doesn't quite mean it, Hall's still thinking one message goes out. And that the whole idea of television is to create a preferred meaning, and that we'd all think about it, right? Now, where's he coming from? Well, he's coming, of course, from German ideology, a certain kind of reading of it, because we can always go back and read it differently. That those who own the means of production own the means of information production and send one message, and we're all supposed to be shaped in it. He's not doing that, but he's coming from that. What's happening in cultural studies? Well, when he writes this piece, it's sort of interesting that it was such a turning point piece. Before it, we have E.P. Thompson, Raymond Williams. We have Marxists who have really spent their energy saying the working class has a culture. It's not elite culture. Elite culture is not what culture should be thought of being. Culture should be more anthropological. It should be a way of life, was Raymond Williams' term. If you say culture is a way of life, then working class people can have it. And you can see it. But it wasn't just to say, as we often do in ethnography, by the way, the preferred method of cultural studies is run out and see the other and say, guess what? They're not really chaotic, they're not really bad, they're not really this. They have a culture. They have order in their chaos. We don't like what they're doing, but they do it orderly in their terms. I mean, this is always, I find, sort of obnoxious, obviously. But it had a political use many times, and so some people don't want to give it away too easily. That we would point out rather than incarcerate them all. Maybe we could understand their culture, right? So, this is an interesting question in the day and age when people speak for themselves, which we've mentioned already. It wasn't just to say they had a culture. It was to say that maybe social change had to circuit through culture. Don't forget we have a Marxism that talks about change in the conflict between modes of production and the forces of production and the relations of production. And don't miss that Marx was already pretty smart about stuff that I was telling you Derrida was saying. And Derrida gives his debt to Marx in his Spectres of Marx with regard to saying smart things about technology, except he has complaints about his ontology, of course, because it starts with being, So the notion that the machinery would, the relationships would come undone and there would be revolutionary change, we always suddenly, when in the 60s, start saying, where is the cultural element in all of this? And Jameson is very aware that something's happening that makes culture interesting. He always is from the beginning. He's a lit crit, so business-wise, he's really happy that people think that culture's important. Let us not forget that. Because, that it's interesting how things come together, right? That Marxism would become so wildly famous in the Academy through a lit crit. Who would have thought it? And some still can't bear it. So, and yet, I think he touched on something. He was sensitized to touch on something. All right. So, comes Althusser, really unsettling something. Let me give you Althusser's great quote. Oh, I expected millions. And Stuart Hall is influenced by Althusser, even more at this time influenced by semiotics, starts to understand you can read messages, you can find things in them, they break down into elements, you can study them. And so that's in coding, decoding, that the message would not just land on someone. Now, Althusser had said, that ideology interpolates people, and this is in the background, that it wasn't just that there would be this one idea and just come down on everyone. It would be more complicated, that in fact the unconscious would have to be involved, that messages would invite, they would hail, hey you, he actually said, and people would respond in allowing their subjectivities to be positioned, if not shaped and formed, by the hail. Now, while Althusser obviously implied something complicated is going on, because he was talking about the unconscious, which is an uncomplicated thing, talking about, let us say, inviting people in at the level of pleasures, which, Marx didn't have a whole lot to say and go on and on about pleasures, would sort of shape their erotic responses, shape their pleasure responses, serious stuff. And people had done it before, of course, with Marxism. He did think that when they said, hey, you would say, okay, I'm here. I can still see Stuart Hall doing his Althusser lecture. Hey, you, I'm here, because he's a very funny guy. Very, very funny. What Derrida argues, so it's in the background here, is that the message never lands. And if you think of television as not just having three responses to one message, but truly message in transmission or messages in circuitry, and if you take the idea I was suggesting before that there's no origin and slip it in here too, even though we'd have to talk more about how you do that, then you might not say that messages ever just get sent and they ever land, but that we move in and out of them flowing around. And I mentioned at the beginning that if we started at 1973 really thinking about television, which he isn't really, and if we started already thinking about telecommunications and globalization and the movement of capital and the market and stuff as it is today, you might not be able to so comfortably say something goes out and then, let's see, is it landing? Oh, there's 3 weeks. But, it's all over. We've just, millions of dollars have passed while you were waiting for this idea to land, So surely it's very slow, his piece, compared to where it was going. All right, and he certainly writes interesting things now. It's also not uninteresting to notice that there's no mention of race and there's no mention of sexuality, gender, all of which would come in cultural studies, screaming and yelling and pulling Stuart Hall by the hair, although he was always pretty responsive, actually, to those kind of things, my memory of him anyway, and still is, wouldn't you say? I know. And this is certainly not representative, by the way, pedagogically speaking, of what Hall has done or does do now. But it's interesting to ask why it became such an important piece. What came after it? Well, people start saying right away, if there are complicated responses, the message must be complicated, must go out complicatedly. So you've already had the final word on this. Complication may be the condition of possibility of any message. See, there's the Derridian move. Not that messages land complicatedly, but they are in movement. A message is a movement. It's not something that's still and then moves someplace. It is a movement of difference. There are elements composing themselves all the time, and we may be one of those elements. Certainly we are not authors here, or not singularly authors. We come in and out of ongoing messages. That's a very different kind of metaphor than we're used to, I think, even now, still. Okay, so let's go to Jameson. Did I do that? Yes, I think I did that, as much as I want to do with Hall. Many people came after, all interesting, constantly studying responses. Now I'll say one more thing. Constantly studying the message of the machine. What is the machine saying? We looked at television shows. We started asking people what they saw. We tried to see if girls said it different, if boys saw it different, if whites saw it different, if blacks saw it different, if homosexuals, everything. We went through everything, didn't we? Yes, we did. And all painfully, let me tell you, so I don't mean to say it wasn't important what we did. We got into where is the pleasure of it, lefties talking to each other. Can we talk about pleasure? Is pleasure political? Is it not political? Is it allowed? Is it not allowed? I've been through every one of those painful conversations. No, let's forget pleasure. Well, let's go back to the economy finally, because it's so easy to go back there. Meanwhile, things are happening while we're doing all that, trying to figure out what happens here. Okay, I should say one thing. The television's assumed in all of this to be a machine that is working to produce consumption. So notice this is important. It's an advertising machine. And next to advertising, it's an ideological machine. It's teaching people how to conform to capitalist ideology. No matter the fancy words, it's hanging in there. But we're not looking at classes anymore only. And maybe this is important. I don't know what I think about it. Stuart Hall moves away from working class ideology very fast and moves to Gramsci's notion of hegemony. A nice notion, hegemony. I brought it. Did I? You see, hegemony. Yeah. Hegemony implied that the domain of certain formations was secured not by ideological compulsion, but by cultural leadership. The critical point about this is Hall. The critical point about the conception of leadership, which was Gramsci's most distinguished contribution, is that hegemony is understood as accomplished. Notice you have to produce it over and over again. Accomplished not without due measure of legal and legitimate compulsion, but principally by means of winning the active consent of those classes and groups who were subordinated within it. Now, this is a great notion, but Hall uses it quickly to move to the notion of dominant discourse that has to be articulated over and over again in different classes for the purposes of different ideologies. So there's no more one ideology coming from the bourgeois class to the working class. There is no more certainty that there even is where the classes are. He talks more and more of the people versus the dominant discourse. And the people, we're not really sure who they are. Sometimes we could be talking race, sometimes we could be talking gender. Eventually we're talking about the inter-implication of race, gender, class, and gender. We put them all together and certainly not know what we were talking about anymore. Not that that's not interesting, all right? He used Clough, he used Gramsci, always to be looking for how the audience, or in the context, people re-articulated the dominant discourse, and in doing it, engaged themselves in ideology production, encouraged still, though, by the one message to consent to their own oppression. It never, ever leaves. Never leaves. To consent to their own oppression through the unconscious, without even knowing it, all right? I find this sort of interesting because in it there is no discussion about television as a machine. It's assumed to be a machine that is selling a message. And Hall says, and even in 1958, I have here, I'm reading my notes badly, Hall has already really started to think of culture not as a way of life. As far as he goes here, he calls it a series of lifestyles, a series of fragmented patterns for living. So he's definitely in 1973, really in 1950, is what I'm trying to say. And television is working like a consumer machine, selling lifestyles to the people, that their relationship to capital suppression is rather getting fuzzy, but it's still carrying the old message of you're called, you answer, and in the long run you consent. And the leaders are the leaders of capitalist production. Okay? All right. I'm going to leave that for a while and go to Jameson. So you'll see what he does with it. Does with that, all of that. Interesting, huh? Okay. Jameson writes, oh yes, but I need one of those. Do I have my own? I have my own. Jameson writes Political Unconscious in 1981. Still no mention of postmodernism, none of the things that eventually everyone will say everyone knew in 1973, right? Because we didn't know it in 1973. That's another reason to talk about, history being written, being pulled by the future. Because in fact, half of the time when we're writing, we mustn't be writing what we could know. And so we need to go back and read what we might have known but didn't know we know, because we might have left it where we were writing. Yeah, I like that. Okay, so this little quote comes from Reading Capital. Althusser and Etienne Balibar. This is a wonderful, wonderful quote. It is the famous quote. Notice how it's a little close to Derrida. There's no doubt about it that Althusser had his influences on Derrida and Foucault and Lacan, all of them. I mean, they were all together there screaming and yelling up and down the halls. Althusser's big move is to get away from the old tell me what you know and don't know, just by going along the old base superstructure model that some people say that Marx held. As Raymond Williams tells us that he only said it once and people just made a lot of stuff out of that. That's how it goes, right? Somebody locked onto it, and we all said, base superstructure. Poor Marx was turning over in his grave saying, I never said that. So it takes, a major movement to undo a sentence that someone said one night when he was hardly thinking, of course, right? And you think we're authors, right? That we're in control of our own ideas, yeah. So the notion there was that the economy did something and then everything else just sort of fell into place and the base sort of organized the rest. So what Althusser does is very complicated, actually. He says, let's take mode of production and call it the whole thing, which Marx always did. The total historical moment of capitalism will be called the mode of production. And every change that takes place will have to go through the whole structure. No piece inside will be producing other pieces. That every piece inside, he actually said, is relatively autonomous from every other level, and every level is overdetermined. A word he took from Freud. It's Freud's word for that we never know what really causes anything because there's so many things determining and they're overdetermining, and in fact some things start mimicking other things so that you have shadows of things going on. It's very interesting, right? All about the unconscious. Althusser took it, and he says, the structure, there is no structure even. Their structure is only in the effects. Now that's a lot like Derrida. Remember, a generative mechanism that's constantly internally changing, but each time it internally changes, it makes it possible to do the thing it does. So each time the whole thing changes, but somehow we remember. Each time the technique moves its pieces, moves its connections, but each time it allows us to remember and think we're remembering more, which is probably some myth. As I get older, I know how much of a myth that is, actually. So here is the same idea, that only in its effects. Now, I want you to look closely at this quote. So again, the economy is not causing things. The culture is not causing things, but they are all overdetermined in terms of the whole mode of production and they're affecting each other in overdetermined ways, and they're all relatively autonomous. Of course, Frederick Jameson, the literary critic, is going to latch on to relatively autonomous. It does mean he can write endlessly about novels. That's what it means. And say political things. Doesn't have to do economics in some sort of narrow sense of the word. Maybe we should be grateful, who knows. There is the notion of Darstellung, am I saying that correctly? Darstellung, which is Marx's notion for representation in a sort of simple sense of staging or presenting. Okay, and here's what Althusser said, because it's so interesting to see what Jameson does to it. Structural causality. Now we're talking about how does the structure cause. That's where we start. Can be entirely summed up in the concept of Darstellung, the key epistemological concept of the whole Marxist theory of value, surplus value. The concept whose object is precisely to designate the mode of presence of the structural in its effects. And therefore, that emphasis is theirs, is Althusser's. Presence of the structural in its effects. And therefore to designate structural causality itself. The structure is not an essence. Notice, we are going to have a representation of something that does not have an essence. Were we not here already? We were. All these people are way into this. This is what cultural studies was. It was about trying to find dynamic metaphors that are dynamic and therefore are part of our lives in a way. Connected, not after the fact explanations of things. Forms and relations, and which is effective on them as an absent cause, absent because it is outside of them. The absence of the cause in the structure's metonymic causality on its effects is not the fault of the exteriority of the structure with respect to the economic. On the contrary, it is the very form of the interiority of the structure as a structure in its effects, the structure which is nothing outside its effects. Now, let me just read for you two things and then say. Not only had Althusser's rereading of Marx proposed the relative autonomy of economy and culture, treating these as overdetermined levels of the mode of production, he therefore also suggested that the totality of the mode of production is nowhere empirically present. It is a structure in its effects. How then to represent it? I'm reading my writing. How is there representation in the absence of the empirical presence of a given structure? Althusser's answer focuses on Marx's notion of Darstellung, or representation, in the weaker sense of staging. And then I read that quote, which Jameson quotes in the first pages of Political Unconscious. I go on. Althusser's remarks are easily read to propose that capitalism is represented by the mechanism or the machinery which produces the effects of capitalism. That is surplus value. So we could be talking about machines that produce surplus value, right? Represented by the mechanism or the machinery which produces its effects, that is value. It might even be suggested that Althusser's remarks holds closely together the machine or solid metaphor, the machine of production, and the rhetorical device or the metaphoric mechanism for representation of the structure of capitalism. Okay, now what I'm suggesting is, and it isn't just my idea, is that television is the most incredible Darstellung machine that Marx could have ever found. Because it is not only teletechnology producing surplus value, doing the work of capitalism, it is also representing in this sort of old-fashioned way capitalism. Not so much by what's on it, as Stuart Hall had in mind, but actually in some other way, which I'll get to. I mean, it's all around the world, everywhere, bringing capitalism. If we look at the network of all those little televisions, which are everywhere, each time bringing capitalism in its globalized form, which Marx always knew it would be, that capitalism always meant to be global. And I don't mean, therefore, covering all of life or every spot, but it has set its network completely around the world, allowing surplus value to be produced in some way very differently, but not so differently than we might think of factory machines. So what I see you, I'll be right there, but if I don't, then, you know, you have an idea that allows you base and superstructure because you have this technology over there that's making little shoes, and then you have to exploit labor, you know, the first pages of Das Kapital, and, you know, you sell it and blah, 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 and surplus value, right? Whereas then you think of something like cinema or television, as Hall does, as the machine of consumption that has to sell you the idea of capitalism, but isn't doing the work of producing surplus value except to send you out to buy something. I'm suggesting that Althusser always had in mind in that quote that those two machines might wind up being the same machine. And we've got it in teletechnology. Okay? And I think it's the condition of possibility, for instance, of the Derrida. But I want to also show you how upsetting that notion is for Jameson, so he actually changes it around. But the question.
My confusion.
Well, there's so much.
Volume 1 and Volume 3.
Yeah, no, go on. Yeah.
Surplus value can only come from labor, not
Yes.
from capital.
Yes.
So then how can the machine create
Well, I mean,
surplus value?
of course you've asked a good question, and because I know this question,
I'd like to see the reason.
but I want to not do it yet,
Okay.
so I can do Jameson, but I will go there. But let me say something to you. Of course, you know, and I probably don't have my great little Grundrisse. I mean, you know, Marx did have a lot to say about how machinery would so overtake
Right.
labor. I mean, you could say
Right.
machinery is dead labor,
Right.
nor am I sure that we're producing real wealth today through the exploitation of labor. But I'm not saying, you know, I've been through this with Stanley Aronowitz, I'm not saying that there is no labor here. I'm going to say that labor simply is human labor is no longer central to production, but it is always there. But I don't think it's
Right.
central to production right now. I think it's one of the
Well,
issues we face.
That was supposed to lead to the absolute impoverishment of the working class and revolution,
Yeah,
the continual elimination of labor.
right. Well, you heard that, we're either up against the impoverishment of the working class and the world revolution, or we're not. But I want to speak to that. But certainly Marx knew we were going in that direction, and capitalism has gone in that direction. But it seems to me that some of what you raise already troubles what I've already said, that there's some assumption there that there was an originary paradise that we lost. Well, that there was the human being without the meaning machine overcoming it, and not really starting in the beginning in the machine-man link. That we might then do cultural criticism somewhat differently if we couldn't get back to the human before the machine, which Marx always does. He cheats on use value. Okay, but we're not going to do this internal dialogue, but we will, because I've had to think about it. I don't know if I've succeeded, but because I really don't. Notice how it doesn't bother me, but it should. But I'm trying. Okay, with your quote in your hands, I should say that of course Althusser was against the dialectic and against Hegel. Thickly against Hegel. Maybe he read Hegel wrong. We'll never know, because there is such a thing as thinkers making possible new readings. So lots of stuff out now, because Derrida is so down on Hegel and Deleuze is so down on, Deleuze says things that you wouldn't want to say about anybody about Hegel. And he's a snit about it. And people say, oh yeah, but they didn't read Hegel right. And then they read Hegel sort of like Derrida reads Hegel. I mean, they read Derridian Hegel. They find new places and say, see, this was much more complicated, we didn't read that, which I think is very interesting, like I'm doing with Freud. You can go back and say, no, he never said it, he never said ego, he didn't mean that anyway. If he had just seen television, he would have known. So I think there's a post-deconstruction reading of Hegel that turns out that Hegel is, of course, more interesting. But we're talking about a different history here and a certain kind of use of Hegel as a dialectic, and that there's overcoming, and there's a dialectic going on in capitalism where the economic moves you to the next place, and then you overcome that, and then you move on to the great idea, and maybe the great idea of the state besides. I mean, there's lots of complications. Althusser is against it. He's talking about the structure in effect being caused by determinations that you could never say thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and he's very intent on the human quality of Hegel's work, that the human agent is always there, and Althusser is not interested in the human agent, who is not, I shouldn't say not interested, is an effect, of course, of being hailed. There's always something before the human agency, discourse, which has its power as much as the economic, let's say. Okay, so what is Jameson going to do with all this? Well, I can't believe that anyone could be so fascinating as what he's about to do. In Political Unconscious, Jameson recoups, takes all of is a smart guy. There's no doubt about it. Takes all of post-structuralism as he understands it. Deleuze, Foucault, Lacan, doesn't miss a guy, misses all the girls, yeah. Well, it's Jameson. You laugh because it's such pleasures, and it is pleasurable to me too, but it's really true. The girls are missed all the time, and sooner or later it becomes really an issue, not of identity politics, but may I have the pleasure of saying, since you've invited me, of being dumb, about things. So, well, I wouldn't say dumb. I would say phallic. I mean, Jameson is like, and so there's things he doesn't see, and it's interesting. Okay, so here's what he says. He says, of course, he says, Althusser didn't mean it. He didn't mean what he said about Hegel. I know it. And Hegel didn't mean what he said either. I know that as well. And so that's okay. I mean, we do this kind of thing. And so I want to make sure I have, my place. Okay. He says, instead what we could look at is we can look at the lack of mediation, and that what's critiqued about Hegel in Althusser is that we might forget that there's constant mediations. So you can't just have notice the notion of mediation, because we have it in Halter. You can't just have the economic affecting something. Overdetermination implies there's a mediation. There's something intervening all the time, intervening between causes and effects. That's what he was really getting after, Althusser. And so, of course, those of you who know your Hegel might know that there could be an argument here, but it seems like Hegel doesn't, to Althusser sometimes, is talking about not mediating. But, of course, Jameson says, no, he really means Hegel at his best, because Hegel knows there's always mediation, okay? And what we really want to critique is those models, like crude Marxism, that do reduce things to the economic, because they have forgotten that there's no mediation. Then he says, we could look at narratives about culture, because that's what he's going to do, and in political unconscious, and we could critique narratives that teach people how to not look for mediations. We could look for narratives that squish mediations, and we could say that they're immature for the great big narrative. Notice it's coming back, the great big narrative. The big narrative in the end, where all the mediations would allow for rich totality. All right, let me say that again for you, because I'm not sure I made my point as well as I could. If Jameson says, and he does, we're talking Marxism, which he is, the big story to be told is the one you mentioned, the final victory of the working class. If the big story to be told is a collective tale against the oppressions of capitalism and for equality and communism for all, not just for the working class, but as you know, the working class would see all the reasons for doing for having a community, then we have this large narrative. To get to the end of this rich collective story, he says, we have to understand each way, each moment, mediations. And we have to work those mediations through. Because when you go and see what you'll see in each mediation is you'll see contradictions, which of course was Hegel's idea and was Marx's taking on Hegel, that the contradiction, once you could see it, you could work through it. And we have this belief that you could see contradictions and they would lead you through them, and through them would be truth, or another step towards truth. So Jameson says, how come we have some stories that he makes the critique of culture be, and boy did this dominate cultural studies, because it's clever. He made the critique of culture be reading the erasures or the hiding of contradictions. And he takes Althusser's whole story to be, all we have to do is make sure that we have totalities that don't erase contradictions and don't hide mediations. I don't think this is what Althusser was saying at all, but that's what he makes it, so that he can take Althusser's idea in and also keep one notion of history. See, I'm down on this notion because he refuses to let history change. There's one notion of history. It starts at the beginning. We know where it ends. He pretends we don't, but he does. He knows where it ends. It's freedom. Freedom from necessity, he says, is the end. Now, he says, let me help you learn how to read. Because if I teach you how to read, we're going to... now I'm being cute, and I'm cheating a little. We'll have the Marxist revolution. It's almost like what he's thinking. I mean, I think that's what he was sort of thinking. Now, what?
Teach you how to map.
How to map, how to get through all the country. Now, let's look at the ones he finds. So he goes through realism. Now, I hope along the way, because there's many little roads here, but definitely this is one road through cultural studies. He looks at romanticism, realism, and modernism before we get to the piece we're going to do, which then is the postmodernism book. Because in 1981 there is no postmodernism, and there is still hope of a grand narrative, and there is still hope of history, and there is still hope that we'll work through the contradictions. So amazing, 1981. Because a few years later you'll say, all gone. Somebody turned his television on, I'd like to say, So, I do say, I write, he had a television. Why those books? Well, they're European, they're West. Did he bother? No, of course. But, none of us did. But, well, it's the story of modernity, isn't it? It's Marx's story. It's Marx's story through it's a capitalism story through the 19th century into the 20th century of the subject, of the individual, of the bourgeois individual, of ideology, of formations and class, from everything you could care about. He sees that the reason we didn't understand things clearly is because there's literature that fools us into thinking something else. Hey, look, that's not a dumb idea. I don't want to make fun of that idea. It was a brilliant thing to take literature to that serious place. It gave many of us a deep and wonderful understanding of what literature was outside of, it's fun to read or something. And because the novel comes with the rise of capitalism. We've all known this. This is not new. It's not his invention to say that. The story that we'd have to, this is the part I love, that we'd have to learn what we are by reading it first. You know how much I love that. This is a Derridian notion, that it was outside first, that we're not born with what it means to be human, what it means to be individual, that somehow it keeps on getting narrated for us, and we participate in the reading. Now, I'm not going to just say we're hailed or called, and we are, as even he would still imagine. But certainly it plays some role. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here, you and us and me here, right? So, of course, he gives a rich role to it. And he goes and looks, because realism not only is the story of the autobiographical self, of, the great coming-of-age story of being born, of struggling against your mother and father. It's Freud's story as well. This is Freud. And, rising at the end, it looks like the story of the individual. It looks like the story of development. It looks like the story of Darwin. It looks like the story of Hegel. It looks like the story of final revolutions. It's all there. In the production of realism, we have, I'll run ahead so you'll know, the creation of fictive time. We have a linear narrative. You get to read 300 years and how many hours it takes you to read. Most of what's wrong with television, he thinks, is that it's going too fast, the fictive thing. Well, no, there's more to it than that. Fictive time, a linear narrative, a strategy for looking at the future of how to live. In that fictive time, in that narrating of life, in those what we call sutures of cut moments, a lot can be hidden. What does he think can be hidden? Here he says, 3 is obviously the magical number. There's 3 responses and 3 horizons. So Jameson, and it's a wonderful book, There's no doubt about it. And I would like to say, since I'm making fun of Jameson, because I am, that he has a wonderful eye. He reads Conrad like nobody else. The readings are really fantastic. Most people never get past the first 100 pages of that book where he's doing Althusser, because the readings are beautiful. I learned more, because, the readings are not as much in his control. And so you can learn other things than maybe he attended. I learned a lot about cinema from him. He has a great eye. Here are the readings. Against the horizons. We read against horizons in order to undo contradictions. Now, he also used Derrida. He said that Derrida had suggestion that fictions were produced in place of origins, and so you could deconstruct, and he uses deconstruct all the way through. Against the first, the narrative read as an imaginary resolution of a real contradiction that cannot be resolved. The narrative is at first a symbolic act. Notice it's narrative. Okay, so he starts right away by telling you every aestheticization is a symbolic treatment of a contradiction. There's a lot of Marxism assumed there. Okay, so It's sort of interesting, though. I mean, it still floats for me. I mean, it's interesting, right? That if the contradictions of the world are with us and symbolized for us. I mean, okay. The second horizon is to be read in terms of essentially antagonistic collective discourse of the social classes. I mean, it's so obvious, it's sort of cute. That you would turn that symbolization of a contradiction, read the book to see how it hides or how it situates the social classes, and then you would. Here's the big Marxist move that I want to point out to you today. When individual phenomena are revealed as social facts and institutions, when you move to the social class level, of course the contradictions aren't in the individual. They're only displays of larger contradictions. And finally, the text is read against a third horizon, which he takes from Poulantzas, which, is a sort of reading of Althusser. A third horizon, the overlay and structural coexistence of several modes of productions all at once, which, by the way, is a very nice idea. It's also in hegemony, that no mode of production, we'd never be just in modern capitalism or a late capitalism. There'll always be leftover ones. Women was his example of some of the leftover stuff, of course, because, we never, as far as I can see, really gotten out of feudalism, women. Which he says, and which maybe is actually an interesting idea. So there are multiple modes of production. Notice all the movement and the structure. Not only are the levels all over determined, but actually even the thing you think you're supposed to be looking at still has old versions in it. So it's dynamic. You would read through all of those and finally look forward to a revolution. Now he goes to Lacan for the individual, and I just want to say this very quickly before we go on someplace else, but not too quickly, because it's a thought that's taken me a long time to have myself, coming from Marxism. Marxists have always initially liked deconstruction, and I learned all of my post-structuralism from Marxists, because there were lots of them, including Jameson, who were way into it, Stanley Aronowitz, others, okay? Because it deconstructed the subject. Because it deconstructed the notion of a unified subject, or a subject that goes through that life story and sort of transcends in the end into his full being, right? And feminists like deconstruction along this line too. Because, of course, when the man, and it's always, we think a male figure or a phallic figure, when you go through your story and rise in the end as a unified being, the one thing you must really forget is that, she wiped your nose. What we would call the maternal labor that makes it possible for you to finally be a freestanding, self-possessed, self-valorizing, all those self things, words that we usually identify with the individual. Notice there is nobody holding you and da-da-da. So, all of Freud here and the forgetting and the unconscious has some other link to forgetting the mother, as his story goes, right? Repressing that someone took care of you, repressing that you were attached to someone else's body, repressing that you're still sucking your thumb because you really can't give it up, all that kind of stuff, right? So Jameson tells you, I love this, I love the unconscious, we couldn't do without it. His book's called The Political Unconscious, because in fact we have to deconstruct the subject and the individual. But Marxists insistently, I think, if I may, because I know I'm in the company of some who surely know more than I do about this, but Marxists like to deconstruct the subject towards collectivity. It's got to be collectivity. Post-structuralism is the deconstruction of the subject sub-individual. It is not towards collectivity. And this is whether we like that or not, whether it's politically good or not, we cannot miss that someone's been able to think of going sub-individual. Don't ask me. You want to know what that means? Well, certainly it isn't, if you're talking about human-machine link, you might really want to be talking about hand-keyboard link. You might start framing different sort of relationships that don't assume the totality of the human body as some kind of sacred, there's trickiness here, but I think we know how to think it. I think we live in a world that knows how to think it. How to think about it is another matter. How to feel about it is another matter. But to deny that we already can think it is to not notice something. See, that's what I'm trying to say, because I think that sometimes Jameson doesn't want to think some things. Of course, in 1981, I couldn't think any of them either. So, I mean, in all fairness, but... okay, towards collectivity is not the same as sub-individual. And I give you one example there. But the unconscious may not allow... Patricia. I hate when I don't know why I say something. Well, the unconscious for Marxists are always that which you need to talk about while things are bad, and once we get over the bad stuff, it will go away. It's true, isn't it? Well, I think post-structuralism says the unconscious never goes away. There's always an unconscious. And I would love to talk about that sometime. But it's always made a lot of distance between me and certain kinds of politics. Feminism one, which also loves the unconscious, especially when men have them, but not when women have them, because they complicate things, right? And it complicates things. All right. So I think here there's a very interesting move for those of you who are in literature. Jameson gives up Lacan and goes to, oh God, what's that guy's name? Because I could care less. But thank you. You know the books, right? We memorized this book once, didn't we? We did. Fry, yes, because he has a communitarian stuff. I mean, big. I mean, it's very interesting. I think about you now when I read that kind of stuff. Northrop Frye. And listen to Jameson. Listen to this language. Only the community can dramatize that self-sufficient, intelligible unity or structure of which the individual body, like the individual subject, is a decentered effect. So they're very happy, and I understand this, to decenter the body, to decenter the subject, because in doing so you'll be able to really see you're of this intelligible collectivity. Talk about, thinking things are not just, but intelligible collectivity is always human. There's never machines here. Okay, so it's very interesting. All right, what happens now? So I read you some fun stuff because I love reading. And the relation to shows that is to say, when he searches for the... so I can read you this because it's almost nice. Sometimes reading is not that nice. All that Jameson argues for in The Political Unconscious, that literary forms have ideological content. By the way, we were talking about that, and I love that so much, and that was his idea, that forms have ideological content. And this should be interesting to all of you that are in architecture, planning, and certainly he was sensitive to all that stuff. And I learned that lesson forever from him. Not only that forms have content, but they have ideological content, or they're doing something, they're in the interest of da-da-da. I haven't lost that. Derrida also has a notion that Derrida actually thinks there's no difference between form and content, which I prefer. And by the time we get to Tele-technology, you almost can say that. Jameson will never say that because it won't give him what he wants, because he likes content. Literary forms have ideological content, that they resonate with the struggle of the social classes and the contradiction of modes of production, that they provide a subjective form for the cultures of a mode of production. So each literature gives you a subjectivity to live that's most likely going to hide contradictions from you. So you not only have to work through your subjectivity to get through the contradictions, and you have to work your subjectivity towards the collective. Okay? So it's a model. It reminds me of my old days in the church. That they provide, it's a very Christian model. I suppose some of you will have something to say about it. That they provide subjective form of the cultures of a mode of production, especially noteworthy when a mode of production is coming into dominance. And that's what we've, in Marxist terms, surely just lived through. Postmodernity is a new mode of production coming into dominance, and everything is, and maybe someday we'll really only say it that way, I doubt it. seems to fit, especially when mode of production is coming into dominance, seems to fit easily with his study of the generic changes of the novel through romance, realism, modernism, and high modernism. That is to say, linking these generic changes to the rise of market capitalism, followed by industrial capitalism, and finally advanced capitalism seems easy. But when Jameson seeks the generic form of the subject in postmodern culture in order to study its ideological content in relationship to social classes, that is to say, when he searches for the generic form of subjectivity given to the culture of the mode of production of late capitalism, his famous essay, Jameson finds it necessary to shift his focus from the study of the literary form of the novel to the study of machines, which I gave you to read. Primarily the machine of tele-technology. It is then that Jameson not only comes to recognize that all genres of culture are technologically mediated, I'm repeating what you read, I hope. It is also when Jameson begins to struggle with the machine or solid metaphor as it overwrites the machine as rhetorical device for representation. No more metaphors for Jameson, straight to the machine. I think that's interesting. Jameson begins to struggle with television. Still, this is where I get cute, still Jameson cannot look straight at television, God forbid, at least not without worrying about how or if television mediates the levels of the mode of capitalist production, making a collective history possible. Still into that, of course. Uncomfortable with thinking that television might simply put an end to the possibility of collective history, Jameson weds television to his reading of postmodernism, in which he makes postmodernism's negation of mediation into an enactment of capitalist logic or history, thereby at least promising the possibility of historical transcendence in cultural revolution of the mode of production. In other words, he makes postmodernism a culture that denies mediation in a big way, and so therefore must all be a symptom of capital, bad capital. And at least, although that's very bad that it's such a big symptom, when it's a symptom of capital, since he still thinks capital logic promises revolution, eventually we could get over it. If it isn't that, then we can't get over it. And God forbid it should be really displacing what has been in the past, without the promise of overcoming it. Well, I don't know, but it's very cute, is it not? So what Jameson does then, and I want to say two more things, and then, I could wind down, because there is some, maybe I'll jump to one other thing. So in that piece and in other pieces, Jameson argues things like this. Technological development is, however, on the Marxist view, the result of the development of capital rather than some ultimately determining instance in its own right. So one of the things I've noticed that disturbs me, not that I don't know how to do it myself, is that for Jameson, and I think for Marxists in general, technology is only an effect of capital. Capital is prior to technological development. And we all know how to do that, right? Because, we did it already, because it's interesting to displace the laborer, blah, 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 blah. What if we don't talk ontologically human first? What if we don't put being first, with a capital B, and then human being? What if we start talking link, man-machine? How bad of me. Human being machine. Or human parts and machine parts. I'm taking that plastic liver when they give it to me, aren't you? Yes, you are. I hope you will. Well, maybe you won't. I shouldn't assume these things like that. But that's the upside. Of course, we got downsides coming too with eugenics and all kinds of things. I know. But if the answer is all the good is without the machines, I don't believe it. I don't believe it anymore that we're giving them up. I think our lives depend on them. I don't think we can give them up. So what if we start rethinking links, I was suggesting. Now, why do Marxists make technology subject to capital? Well, I'm going to say it's for what I just said, so that they can overcome it in the end. And I don't say that maybe we shouldn't think through technology and that a lot of it might be bad and stuff, but since it's not all going to be bad, I don't know what overcoming means anymore. So this is what happened, and this you have to know for pedagogy. because I know you know that cultural studies and postmodernism and all that stuff's connected with no more history, no more subjects, no more anything. And it came straight from the mouth of Frederick Jameson, not from anybody else. And then, or Baudrillard. But Baudrillard's all over this particular Jameson. I'm saying that because it's Jameson who says that postmodernism is about the end of history. It's Jameson who says that postmodernism is about the waning of effect. It's Jameson who says that postmodernism is about the collapse of pleasure and pain and sadomasochism, and it's all the same. It's Jameson with the eye of making it that so we can overcome it. Do you understand? So I'm not sure these are the best descriptions, although they have come easy to all of us to use, myself included. Because in some ways they speak to the end of what was dynamic in a prior history. Yes. What they don't make room for very much is what the new history should be about. So they don't look at television enough. This is all just my way of telling you I love watching telly. So, here it goes. The symptoms or set of symptoms which Jameson ascribes to postmodern culture are now well known. Fragmented subject, the waning of effect, the collapse of difference between pleasure and pain, the intensification of emotionalism. Oh God, it does seem true on 4:30 at television. The severing of the image from its material basis, the snap of signification into a rupple of distinct and unrelated signifiers. Listen to his language, it makes you upset just reading it. Depth gone, there is nothing but pastiche, his famous line, a quoting or a citing without end, beyond which a nostalgia that turns every work of art into nothing but text. They are cheating on what Derrida meant by there's nothing outside the text. Okay, so let me do a little sweet one for you, and then maybe you will talk to me about the reading. In the logic piece, the one you didn't read, there's a great example he uses. You know it? Who knows it? It's Van Gogh's boots. You know Van Gogh's boots? We all know Van Gogh's boots. You know the boots? Oh, show the picture. Pass the picture around. And the cover, yeah, there they are. There's the cover there's the boots, and the cover is Andy Warhol's Diamond Dust slippers. Now, quickly, I can tell you, because otherwise I'll want to read, and I don't want to do that, because I probably could do this, and then one more thing, and then open. He argues that when you look at Van Gogh shoes, and you'll see it, you see still the peasant, you see labor, you see use value, you see, and there's a whole Heidegger read there, you see nature, you see the whole, there's no more peasant there. And you see and he even talks, and this is what I love about Jameson, if you look at the color, you see a wash of vibrancy that the poor laborer doesn't feel because it's utopian, and there's revolution in that painting. But that's really nice to learn how to read color. I don't know why we should think that's what that means, but, it is interesting. It is an interesting interp, and I was touched. Of course, when you look at Andy Warhol, what you see immediately is the photograph. That is a painting, but you see the photograph, the black and white death. I'm quoting because, the language was important because it carried. You see the deathly technology of photograph underneath that painting. There is no depth. There is no labor. Nobody cares who's wearing those shoes anymore. They're not worn. They're just hanging up. They're commodities. They're fashion design. They're capitalism, and they're disgusting. So he goes on like that. Well, very interesting, of course, Heidegger in truth. Heidegger also, and he knows. So while I can make fun of him, I also, have to tip my hat to the sewing he does here of who he connects. And he goes back here to Heidegger. I'm not going to do Heidegger for you, but we should do Heidegger sometime because it is the secret of some things here. He goes back to Heidegger because Heidegger also read that painting and said very interesting things also about Gestell and, what we should take technology to be, what the farmer is, what culture is when you're digging dirt. A lot of romanticism about digging dirt and nature. See, the laborer, nature, digging dirt, everything always seems to get worse when you can't still see the dirt. And when you only see, the productions of machines producing other machines, producing other machines, producing other machines. Now, Heidegger had a notion that if you framed things, that the framing defines the real. Notice how close Marx and Heidegger go here, and Derrida and Freud. If you frame the real so it looks real, remember we were just doing realism? The frame, of course, is a staging of the real, and is therefore a trick, right? And Heidegger suspected that we were going to get terribly involved in framing so fast that eventually there'd be nothing but frames, and there'd be no real act. Have you watched television lately? Have you zapped lately? Well, it's there, right? I mean, you would think it was there. Jameson describes postmodernism of the outframing of reality in so many words, nothing but frames, and he thinks this painting shows it. Well, Derrida has also written about these paintings and has said really wonderful intervention. Meyer Shapiro has also written about these paintings. And Meyer Shapiro actually thinks the paintings, that those boots are Van Gogh's boots, an urban, cosmopolitan painter's boots, not peasant's boots. Derrida says, what's with these two guys? All they can think of is who's in the boots. Because we won't know the truth of the boots unless we put the human being back in them, he says. And then he shows a series of Van Gogh's paintings, some of which look just like diamond dust boots, lined up. Just like that. It's just sort of interesting. There's a line. I love reading like this because, it's so much fun. Jameson has a line. I swear to God, Derrida said something about these boots. I can't remember what he said or where I read it. You see how we reveal in the piece. It's probably true he couldn't remember where it was. So I had to really work hard to find that, where Derrida actually said that, because I had never read Truth in Painting. So, all right. So I want to say one last thing. Oh, no. Maybe I shouldn't. He's putting his shoes on. I wanted to just say one last thing about television and capitalism, which was going to take me to your place, but let's see if I can do it quickly. Why is television the Darstellung machine of late capitalism? I'm referring here now to Richard Deinst, who is a Marxist and a student of Jameson, but a really smart, all of Jameson's students are probably smart, but a really smart guy, this guy. I like him a lot. He says that the television, as I suggest before, represents world capitalism because it actually puts the machine all around the world, literally, and ties the entire world to technology. I don't know if he's crying there. I think he is more than I would, but he is. Then he actually says the most profound thing that I've read in a long time. He says, how does it produce surplus value? So he answers your question. So don't go yet. Oh God, I hope I could do this because now I'm getting tired. He goes back to the machine system. Here's his quote. If the machine system of large-scale industry radically collectivized and redistributed social labor time, because remember, Marx says we sell social labor. The labor is not selling just his time, right? Labor time. According to capitalist imperatives, the television system now performs the same function for other segments of time. Pleasure time, public or community time, household time, parenting time, childhood time, even animal and vegetable time. Certainly advertisers buy time, but it is socialized time. Just as the capitalist buys labor power rather than an individual's labor, so the advertiser buys a unit of social time power, the hypothetical fusion of free time and free images, calibrated in price according to estimates and averages of productivity and potential return. Television, in its fundamental commercial function, socializes time by sending images of quantifiable duration range according to its own cultural coordinates. Everybody is free to spend time in their own way only because on another level the time is gathered elsewhere, no longer figured as individual. This is truly terrifying, actually. Deinst returns to the viewer who Jameson had put aside. The viewer produces surplus value. when the configuration of socialized time and image, having already been capitalized, is used up in the watching. And he actually takes Marx's metaphor and says that while we're watching television, because it's time that's now being sold, and Lord knows we know this, right? It's the volatility of we don't know this. Thank you for reminding me we don't all know I like to say, Lord, we all know this when I'm not sure we know this, but surely the ability to move capital fast, the ability to have access to speed is certainly central to wealth making. And I don't know that surplus value is the same as real wealth. So, there's some questions about whether surplus value is the whole answer nowadays anyway, but okay. Well, it gives you some range. What I'm doing in my chapter is to say that cultural studies spend too much time looking at what was on television, and that we needed to look more at the technology of television that I think even television shows now reflect. Oh, you're all going to go now?
Yeah, classic.
Yeah, I know. Oh, well, I'm sorry. Okay, next time. Thank you very much.
Let's get a quick moment of applause. But if you have a minute and people want to...
I have time, yes.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure, please, anyone who...
When you talk about surplus value,
I promise not to talk so much, Nick.
We'll be over
is that in a pure Marxist sense? What's the definition of that? And is it the same or different from what people call in marketing today value added?
Ooh, what's value added? Surplus value is, I think, from Marx always, it's the exploitation of the laborer, right?
Unpaid labor.
Unpaid labor time. Well,
Unpaid, okay.
well, it's the difference between the wage and what. So the labor is sold like a commodity,
Right.
by the hour,
Right.
and what he's exchanging is his time for that money. And when he makes enough in certain hours to reproduce his own labor time, the rest, one might say, he's making the surplus value. He's making value beyond what he got paid for, and he actually produces the capitalist money for further investment. This was Marx's brilliant idea, to show that it's the laborer who is at the heart of the whole system, because the surplus value is then reinvested, because reinvestment is central. But I've read stuff now where, wealth, which is not quite the same as surplus value, I suspect, and the movement of capital from one market to the next, in which you make billions of dollars. Well, labor's there somewhere, but where? I mean, I don't, because let's understand that Marx not only explains something about the labor, he gives a metaphor about labor and the human being. So while I would never say that capitalism isn't still exploiting laborers, now it's all around the world to go looking for that, I don't know if it lends the same kind of metaphor about the human being and wealth production. But, I don't know what I'm saying there. Yes. What's a value added?
So value added is